B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Monday, April 20th, 2020. That's 4/20/2020. And just a quick note, do not despair, but your humble host is declaring a day off tomorrow because it's my birthday, and then it'll be Earth Day. But I want to zero in on media malpractice that's underway in this country right now. I am exposing what I consider to be real fake news. Most of the time, Trump uses that fake news label to deflect, distract, and to outright deceive people. But with the enabling, I'm not calling it a conspiracy, it's not fascism, it's the chase for ratings and careless journalistic practices. And these are not limited to Fox News. In general, mainstream media outlets are reporting these mini mobs that are showing up across the country, demanding to be set free from the restrictions of home confinement, mask wearing, and other required and prescribed measures to try to suppress transmission of the coronavirus. And as I first called it on Friday, this is an organized effort to produce B-roll. And again, B-roll is the pictures that they show behind the news anchor that often drive home messages more powerfully than the blather that the talking head is reciting. And they are manufacturing B-roll to make it look like there are masses of protesters popping up all across the nation who are chafing at the unconstitutional restrictions of their freedom. And some of it might be somewhat naive on the part of these people who just want to get back to work, and maybe they're desperate to get back to work. But it is being driven by gun extremists, allies of Trump, and it creates this recycling effect. And as it recycles, it gets amplified to the point that a lot of people believe that these are freestanding movements of great Americans who are out there to protect their liberties at this time of crisis. And so there were a number of these events across the country this weekend. We'll describe a few of them. But I watched in horror on Saturday as CNN flew a chopper over Huntington Beach, California. Now, this is along the coast of Orange County, and it is a hotbed of right-wingers. Has been for a long time. So CNN featured this, and they played the same loop. They had about 18 or 20 seconds of chopper footage of people, some in their cars, some holding signs up for passing traffic. But there are no more than a couple of hundred people out there, and it was a pretty nice day. And yet, this is given the false equivalency. And I'll note that they also showed footage of desperate people lined up in their cars for miles or shortchanging social distancing as they queued up outside a grocery store, desperate for food. And I care a lot more about the hungry people than the gun-toting right-wingers who are doing the bidding of Donald Trump to create this crazy image that, number one, they don't care if they contract the virus and give it to other people because their rights are more important. And they're actually contradicting the policies of the Trump White House as he beams his approval because it helps stoke his base and his self-styled image as an anti-government guy. But he runs the goddamn government. And the incoherence of that doesn't appear to occur to any of these people. And as I called out the New York Times for false equivalency, in some of their their news analysis and opinion pieces. You get direct contradiction without bothering to name the New York Times as a source of the justification of these protests. So let me begin with a good piece from the Times under the byline of Maggie Haberman, and she covers Trump and is pretty good at it. And this is called a political memo, so it's not a news column. Not quite an op-ed either, it's somewhere in between. You might call it analysis. And she writes, in the past few days, Trump has nurtured protests against state-issued stay-at-home orders aimed at curtailing the spread of the coronavirus. Hurtling from one position to another is consistent with Trump's approach to the presidency over the past 3 years. Even when external pressures and stresses appear to change the dynamics that the country is facing, Trump remains unbowed, altering his approach for a day or two only to return to nursing grievances. So this identification as a victim himself and a leader of victimized Americans is really important to him. It is a key, as Dr. Justin Frank, the psychiatrist, shared with us in an interview almost a month ago now. And Haberman continues, with Trump's poll numbers falling after a rally around the leader bump, he is road testing a new turn on a familiar theme, veering into messages aimed at appealing to Americans whose lives have been disrupted by the legally enforceable stay-at-home orders. And this goes back and forth, too, in his battles demonizing governors and the states that don't bend to his will, saying that he is the paramount authority, and then saying, well, never mind, you guys handle it, and then I'll snipe at you along the way and take credit for any success. And the new poll from NBC Wall Street Journal, released on Sunday, only 36% of voters say they generally trust what Trump says about the virus. But, she writes, Trump is most comfortable raging against the machine of government even when he is the one running the country. And a little later, she writes, a quote from Trump here. And this was either at Saturday or Sunday's. This one was on Friday. They all run together, and I've stopped watching. I simply can't handle the bullshit that he is serving up. But Trump said approvingly, these are people expressing their views. They seem to be very responsible people to me. But he said he thought the protesters had been treated rough. Come on. They're getting what they want, which is television coverage that he then recycles to use to build his base in the Trump nation, which is a minority, but one that will dutifully show up to vote for him. And it reminds me of Charlottesville, where when the white nationalists, neo-Nazis came out to march and attacked Jews openly, Trump said, well, there are good people on both sides. Now, Haberman acknowledges so far the protests have been relatively small and scattershot, organized by conservative-leaning groups with some organic attendance. And I think that's accurate. Then she quotes Stephen Moore, a former Trump advisor, who's now over at FreedomWorks, right-wing, limited government think tank. He said he thought protesters ought to be wearing masks and protecting themselves, but the people who are doing the protests, for the most part, these are the deplorables. They're largely Trump supporters, but not only Trump supporters. And on Sunday, Trump added to his praise, I have never seen so many American flags. Come on, as if this is patriotic. That my rights to avoid being infected by you end at the muzzle of your gun. And so they analyze the political pros and cons of Trump supporting these mini-mobs. Mike Pence kind of danced around it. The American people know that no one in America wants to reopen this country more than President Donald Trump. And most people don't bother to mention that the states that Trump has talked about liberating don't come close to meeting the standards that he enumerated in a scripted presentation at the same damn podium on Thursday. So we are truly into a bizarre zone here. Now, to its credit, this is a news column from the Washington Post. Headline, pro-gun activists using Facebook groups to push anti-quarantine protests. And what they basically disclose is that there are three guys whose last name is Dorr. They are brothers. There's Ben Dorr, the political director of Minnesota Gun Rights, and his brothers Christopher and Aaron. And they head up gun rights organizations in other states. These are the people who think that the National Rifle Association is soft. So online activity instigated by the brothers helps cement the impression that opposition to the restrictions is more widespread than polling suggests. 70% of Republicans said they supported a national stay-at-home order, but we don't have one. It's done state by state. And there are a couple of states that still haven't even attempted it. And as I mentioned, on Thursday, Trump outlined 3 phases for states to reopen safely. And I think almost all the states that have had protests don't come close to meeting them. It requires 14 days of declining new cases and hospitalizations and things of that sort, among other criteria. And so Facebook is allowing these ads to run, even though they are restricting or flagging the free expression of some people who are contrarian about the virus, the risk of the virus, I'll put it that way. So, Wisconsinites Against Excessive Quarantine was created last Wednesday on Facebook by Ben Dorr. Christopher, his brother, is the creator of Pennsylvanians Against Excessive Quarantine and Ohioans Against Excessive Quarantine. And the third brother, Aaron, he's got the page New Yorkers Against Excessive Quarantine. Now, these pages have all, in short order, attracted tens of thousands of people who like them or follow them. I revealed last week that the DeVos family and its political arm, through a dubious foundation, helped fund the first protest with a lot of guns exposed in Michigan. The other operatives are a Republican state lawmaker and his wife, Michonne Maddock, who sits on the Trump campaign's advisory board. And Michonne is a female. She's also a prominent figure in the Women for Trump coalition. And it's no surprise that that's why Gretchen Whitmer, the Democratic governor of Michigan, who, by the way, I think is handling this crisis very well, but she's not very progressive, and I'm not crazy about her running as a Democratic candidate for vice president. So, as I have described it, this is AstroTurf. This is a concoction. And in too many cases, the corporate media treats it as real. Now, one bright spot here is that in Denver, when the protesters did a blockade from cars of the streets around the state capitol, a group of nurses in scrubs showed up and put their bodies on the line in front of these, what's depicted as a big SUV. And to me, it's reminiscent of Tiananmen Square, where that one man stood in front of a tank. Yeah, so here is this guy in green scrubs wearing a face mask, standing right in front of this truck. And it's a big old fancy truck. Can't quite see the logo to tell you what brand it is. But as he stands there, you're going to hear the voice of a woman, and she's an overweight blonde lady in it's a red, white, and blue shirt. I can't read the message that's on it. And she's holding a sign that says Land of the Free. And this is what she yells at the silent nurse, a male nurse, standing and blocking her way.
$35,000.
So one guy is yelling back at the woman, 35,000 have died, as she holds her land of the free sign and repeatedly shouts, go to China. If you want communism, go to China. Now, this is an incoherent rabble. And compare it to any kind of anti-war protest that you've seen in Washington or elsewhere in the last 20 years that gets no coverage, gets totally blacked out by the corporate media. And here, a couple of hundred people sounding their horns on a Sunday afternoon in Denver, it dominates the news. And I'm really proud of those nurses who, I don't think they were in any real risk of being run over by those people, but it could have happened, like it did in Charlottesville. So here's another yellow journalism piece in the New York Times. It was published on Sunday regarding a protest of these people in Austin, Texas on Saturday that was organized by the people around InfoWars, and Alex Jones did show up and spoke. The headline reads, Crowds protest stay-at-home order in Texas as defiant wave sweeps nation. See, that headline alone shows that this is a credible nationwide movement. It's sweeping the nation. There isn't a hint that this is orchestrated by the very people that I just described from the Washington Post story. And while there is a slightly mocking tone to this piece, especially when Alex Jones is described, let me quote a little bit. The modest crowd at the You Can't Close America rally was proudly defiant of the local and state stay-at-home orders that they were violating simply by assembling. Governor Greg Abbott's executive order states that all Texans shall minimize social gatherings, and city and county officials in Austin have required people to wear face coverings in public. Well, I'm looking at a crowd of a couple of hundred people. I don't see a single face mask. They are all crowded together. And there's another separate picture of Alex Jones working the crowd and shaking hands. A few of the demonstrators, says the Times, wore masks, but most did not. And they cite a female, Jax Weaver, out-of-work Austin photographer who went there with her 7-year-old daughter. I'm not worried about catching the virus. If we did catch the virus, I feel that we're healthy enough to fight it, and I think it would help us build immunity. So she wants it, in so many words. Then they talk about the rally rode a wave of similar protests at state houses and in city streets this past week, with people also gathering in Indianapolis, Carson City, Nevada, Annapolis, Maryland, and Brookfield, Wisconsin. Oh, also Salt Lake City, where an organizer, a former cop, said, "Thank you, government officials, for your recommendations, but we're going back to work." So this is really troubling, because they have the right to assemble except where they don't. In some cases, they have the right to open carry in public. But this is a concoction that is being used by Trump to make him the champion of reopening America, and it's just those Democrats, it's always the Democrats, and these pointy-headed health officials who are preventing it. And I heard the same rant from Rush Limbaugh as I drove to the secret studio this morning. It's really dangerous. And because, as I point out, in some cases, people are packing, this brings a whole mob mentality with an armed mob into play. And once or twice I've mentioned this new HBO series, The Plot Against America. It's a fictional history of the early 1940s based on the false, the very clear fiction that Charles Lindbergh was elected president in 1941, and that, Roosevelt was deposed, and that Henry Ford, the open racist, was a central figure in, again, a fictional scheme to relocate Jews from their neighborhoods in New Jersey and New York to other parts of the country. And if you haven't started to watch it, I urge you to. It's a very powerful series. All right. Adding to this is that in Florida, in Jacksonville, they loosened the restrictions, allowing people to go to beaches in Duval County. Now, Florida has, I would have to estimate, thousands of miles of beach. I've been on the Atlantic side, I've been on the Gulf side, and the beaches stretch as far as the eye can see. But what do we see? People congregating in ways that violate the rules or the advice. And it's just so frickin' crazy. Now, even though local officials like the mayor of Jacksonville said, look, this is a time for exercise. You can go out for short periods of time. It's not a sunbathing opportunity. But they're not enforcing that. And these herds of sheep who believe this is some kind of expression of liberty. It's just, it's depressing. Whatever faith I've had in America is eroding fast and sharply. Then we have Trump with these daily TV appearances that the networks coddle him with. And just on Friday, we were reporting his couch, he's in the White House quarters watching TV, and he is sniping on Twitter at Andrew Cuomo while Cuomo is actually giving his daily briefing. And then at Sunday's Opportunity Free Media Zone, he trotted out some more deceptively edited video. This of Cuomo saying nice things about Trump. And, we are moving into this completely fictional reality show where Trump says, the states and these complaining Democrat governors, they've got everything they need. Stop bothering me. And Cuomo has responded, I have asked the president 11 times for help with the testing that is needed in order to reopen, lift the restrictions, and allow people to go back to work. And Cuomo says that Trump said back to him 11 times, I don't want to get involved in testing. It's too complicated. It's too hard. And Cuomo responded, I know it's too complicated and too hard. That's why we need help. I can't do an international supply chain. And to see this politicized, even if you believe that this is all overblown and that, a bunch of governors and other leaders reacted too hastily and emotionally, that's not my view, but I know many people hold that view. To see the president use this to continue to divide Americans and for naked partisan political purposes is just outrageous. And the media's involvement here is key. If they cut off that White House feed, if Twitter shut him down when he lied or supported mob-style activity, it might be different. But they're not doing that. And there's very little news value in these daily parades in the White House briefing room. So here's a piece from Rick Rojas in the New York Times regarding the testing issue. And on television yesterday, I saw Ralph Northam, governor of Virginia, a pretty courageous Republican, Larry Hogan, governor of Maryland, and Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. They also said, look, they all said pretty much the same thing. Northam was the most outspoken, who called the claim of the White House and Mike Pence, vice president in particular, delusional. Whitmer said her state could perform double or triple the number of tests if we had the swabs or reagents. Last night I saw pictures, but I could not bring myself to turn the audio on, of Trump pulling Q-tips out of his suit pocket, as if they are adequate to conduct the swabs, particularly the throat swabs. And so the idea that Trump is just so raring to go and wants to jump the gun is quite risky, because we don't know what'll happen. But there is a high likelihood that there could be a new wave of infections, hospitalizations, and death that might live up to the projections that haven't come to pass so far. And the fact that the social distancing, the stay-at-home orders appear to have worked is now fodder for irrational right-wingers who say, see, it wasn't a big deal. It's just like the flu. What you talking about? So in the latest funding package that is being hashed out in the Senate, the Democrats have gotten the Republicans to yield and include $25 billion for testing. Now, I don't know what each test costs anymore, or how much the reagents, the swabs don't cost much, but you got to have them. Is $25 billion even close to what's needed? The Democrats have also gotten $75 billion for hospitals. Is that sufficient? We know that the original money allocated for small business loans wasn't enough, and the main focus of this Republican-originated package is $300 billion to replenish that fund. But is that enough? Nobody seems to know. Nobody seems to bother. They're just throwing figures at the wall, saying, oh, yeah, that's about right. Well, in the first round of the money that was designated for loans to small business, the Paycheck Protection portion of the bailout, the federal government gave national hotel and restaurant chains millions of dollars before the money ran out. And let's single out Shake Shack. I kind of like their food. They got a $10 million loan, and they're giving it back after they discovered that the small restaurants it was intended for didn't get a dime. And this is so hard to pronounce. I've been to this steakhouse, and, for $75, you can get a really nice steak at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. Whew, I said it the first time. Now, this is a chain with 150 locations, a value, equity value of $250 million. They got a $20 million loan. And my pal Rob at the Rib Shack in Sonoma, I'll bet he didn't get a dime. The Potbelly chain of sandwich shops, 400 locations, market cap $89 million, got $10 million last week. This is the kind of corruption that the Democrats tried to fight with an inspector general, and Trump said, F you. More than 70 publicly traded companies reported receiving money from the program for small business loans, attempting to keep the fry cook and the waitress on a payroll until you can get through this. It's piracy. That's what it is. And this amused me on Saturday in the New York Times. They described how uneasy Republican senators are that Steve Mnuchin is the point man conducting the negotiations over this new package. Steve Mnuchin presided over the foreclosure of thousands of homeowners in Orange County before he was tapped to become Secretary of the Treasury. And he's being accused of being a Democrat, a closet Democrat, because he has ties to Hollywood. He wrote some checks to some Democratic candidates, just like Trump did. And I have no book for Steve Mnuchin. I think he's a greedy capitalist creep. But for the Republican senators to say, oh, he's giving away the store, just more comic relief. Over at The Intercept, Robert Mackey wrote a column, and I didn't need to get past the headline. He said, if Trump supports all these protests, why doesn't he show up at one? Well, one of his idols, the strongman and would-be dictator of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, he showed up at a rally in Brasilia on Sunday. As the number of deaths in Brazil rose to 2,500 on Sunday, he was out there to stoke protests. And his agenda goes beyond just stay-at-home orders and wearing face masks. He is angling to become the next dictator of Brazil. And, you know, it was a military dictatorship in the 60s up until the mid-80s. So that's what he's angling for. I'm sure Trump is jealous because Bolsonaro has a full head of hair, no comb-over, and it appears he's pretty buff. Plus, he has authoritarian rule, and he's expanding it on a daily basis. Okay, now whiplash as we get an actual opinion piece from Charlie Warzel at the New York Times. Some good quotes here. The opener. At a string of small Reopen America protests across the country this weekend, maskless citizens proudly flouted social distancing guidance while openly carrying semi-automatic rifles and waving American flags and signs with ironic swastikas. They organized chants to lock up female Democratic governors, fire the country's top infectious disease experts. At one point during protests in Michigan, the group's orchestrated gridlock blocked an ambulance en route to a nearby hospital. Then he takes us to Texas with Alex Jones and how he never lets reality get in the way. He's holding a stay-at-home order protest in Texas the day after the state announced it would begin efforts to carefully reopen in coming weeks. Later, Warzel writes, it's important to note that the reopen protests have been generally small, at most hundreds of people in states of millions of citizens responsibly staying at home, and don't even reflect the polled opinions of many conservatives. But they fit neatly into a larger campaign playbook and take on outsized importance. They take place frequently in swing states or states with Democratic governors and are plastered across social media, reported in mainstream organizations. Go ahead, name the times, dude. Openly cheered on by Fox News and right-wing media, and ultimately end up amplified by the president. The strategy worked well in recent years, consolidating support among the Trump base. He continues, as a political movement, the Make America Great Again crowd relishes turning criticism from ideological opponents into a badge of honor. Confrontation of any kind is currency. People taking offense to their actions is a surefire sign that they're correct. The MAGA mindset prioritizes freedom above all, especially the freedom from introspection, apologizing, or ever admitting defeat. This response is disguised as an expression of liberty, but it's a twisted, paranoid, and racialized version. In his closer, here we are in 2020 protesting statewide lockdowns intended to save lives while thousands of Americans across the country grow sick and die each day. That a virus that demands a united front, where our public health is only as strong as our least vigilant citizens, should come at a moment of extreme polarization is a tragedy. But this moment is what we've been headed toward for years. And the stakes get higher every day. In Kansas, a federal judge appointed by Trump has ruled to allow church gatherings to resume. Well, you know how that works. A note from The Guardian that I haven't seen coverage of elsewhere in American media. High levels of air pollution may be one of the most important contributors to deaths from COVID-19. The analysis shows that of the coronavirus deaths across Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, 78% of them occurred in just 5 regions, and these were the most polluted. Now to our daily COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. And the worldwide death count is 168,000. Total reported cases, nearly 2.5 million. In the United States, the death count varies from one source to the next, but NBC said late Sunday that it passed 40,000, with consensus that the reported infections or confirmed cases are about 750,000. And she tells us the head of the World Health Organization has warned that the worst is yet ahead, particularly in third world nations. In Israel, police clashed Sunday with stone-throwing ultra-Orthodox men and youths in Jerusalem's Men Shiram neighborhood who were protesting against restrictions. 5 demonstrators were arrested. Several dozen people took part. Well, again, several dozen people is not representative, but it gets reported as if it is, and that's a citation from the Times of Israel. There are new rules for nursing homes, just a little bit late, coming from the Trump administration, as the earliest infection zone or the flare-up zone in Kirkland, Washington, was at a nursing home. And it should be no surprise that we've seen that play out all across the country. One of the new policies requires nursing homes to report cases directly to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and a second requires them to inform residents, their families, and representatives of COVID-19 cases in their facilities. There's been a lot of secrecy and families left to guess whether their elders are at risk or even have died. On Sunday, Trump again praised the federal response, showed reporters that video from Cuomo that I mentioned, the selectively edited one. Quotes that Linda captured from Trump. It should be a local thing because it's all these points within a state, but we're helping them a lot, and we want to help them a lot. You must remember that the governors wanted to have total control over the opening of their states. But now they want to have us, the federal government, do the testing. And again, testing is local. So this guy is so incoherent. And there are a few television reporters and anchors who will basically tally up his misleading, misdirecting, and deceptional comments. But for the most part, they just let him play on. The latest from Anthony Fauci: unless we get the virus under control, the real recovery economically is not going to happen. So what you do if you jump the gun and go into a situation where you have a big spike, you're going to set yourself back. And I cited the other governors. Linda picks up on comments from Washington State's Jay Inslee, a Democrat. He said, I don't know any other way to characterize it when we have an order from governors, both Republicans and Democrats, basically designed to protect people's health, literally their lives, to have a president basically encourage insubordination, to encourage illegal activity, to have an American president encourage people to violate the law. I can't remember any time during my time in America where we have seen such a thing. He said Trump's comments are dangerous because they can inspire people to ignore things that actually can save their lives. And that his promotion of the protests is hobbling our national efforts to protect people from this terrible virus. And I want to add in here a front-page story from Sunday's New York Times that doctors are sounding an alarm because it turns out that ventilators, which have been essential for some cases, they're also requiring dialysis units because many COVID-19 patients present or end up with kidney failure, and there is a shortage of dialysis machinery and trained people to operate them. So this could be another issue where there will be no federal coordination, and states and local medical centers are going to be left on their own. Also, Linda updated with this: hundreds of thousands in L.A. County may have the coronavirus. There's been an antibodies test that found that between 2.8% and 5.6% of adults have the antibody, indicating they had the infection. And that translates in L.A. County to potential infection rates of 200 to 440,000 people. Linda also zeroes in on the profiteering, focusing on the Trinity Private Equity Group, a middle-market sponsor of private equity transactions in which the firm partners with existing management in high-quality companies. And they state that their number one core value is that they put their investors' interests first. So they've made investments in companies with a consistent history of profitability and growth, And they are positioned to buy badly needed health equipment, including PPE, from American companies, and then flip it out on the open market with huge markups. And this kind of profiteering, of course, that hedge funds and private equity funds engage in is scurrilous at a time like this. But they seem to have no shame. Over at New York Magazine, there is a whistleblower who is somehow, I wouldn't put him in, say that he was in charge, but he was tasked with gathering critical medical equipment, face masks, goggles, face masks, goggles, shields, gowns, respirators, the N95s. And he's representing some group in Massachusetts. It's a little sketchy here, I guess, to protect his identity. So he says, our group has worked around the clock to secure this important gear, and deals, some bizarre and convoluted, many involving large sums of money, have dissolved when we were outbid or outmuscled, sometimes by the federal government. He describes that a lead came from somebody on the team. After several hours of vetting, they felt that this broker was going to be able to deliver a large shipment of 3-ply face masks and the N95s. And so they checked out some samples. They got the cash together, more than 5 times the amount they would normally pay. They set a plan in motion. And to avoid detection, they used tractor-trailer rigs that had signage on the outside that there was food, that they represented a food distribution company. So they went to an unidentified warehouse in the mid-Atlantic region. This guy showed up by car. He examined the merchandise, and they had 2 different routes to haul it back to Massachusetts with 2 big rigs to minimize the chance that they would be detained or redirected. So they have to use, spy ops. Okay, so then the FBI shows up just as they're loading these trucks. And they wanted to make sure this was an up-and-up transaction. They wanted to make sure that the PPE was bound for hospitals. And he writes, but I was soon shocked to learn that the Department of Homeland Security was still considering taking our PPE. And only some quick calls leading to intervention by our congressperson prevented its seizure. This is America today. And these are Americans and the federal government operating at cross purposes. As Trump presides over this kind of sowing of discord that we always hear about that Russia is attempting to do to us. It's just totally bizarre. In today's show file, I've linked to a touching profile from the San Francisco Chronicle on Sunday. And they bring us the case of Stacy Allegro. Now, I don't know Stacy that well, but we're friends on Facebook. And I think we connected because she is involved in the yoga community, and I do a little yoga. She was extremely healthy, been a Pilates instructor for 25 years. And she describes her descent into fighting this virus. Her fever and night sweats got worse, then started to rage past logical pain limits, going on for 9 days. She went to the hospital. They confirmed she had pneumonia. I felt like a piñata being punched at a 15-year-old's birthday party. My ribs started hurting, every single bone in my body. The sheets were too heavy on my feet. It was just awful. Then her fever spiked to 103.7. She called her doctor, who told her to go to the emergency room. She got there just wearing sweats, sat down in a chair, and passed out. The next thing I remember, I was in a glassed-in sort of box with doctors and nurses and all kinds of PPE. You don't even know who they are. They're so covered. They look like something out of a really horrible Twilight Zone. What she didn't know is that blood tests showed her liver and kidneys had perilous enzyme and creatinine levels, concerns that could lead to organ distress. She was isolated in a negative pressure room filled with equipment, and the fight of her life began. The first 3 days were a blur, the most pain that she has experienced in her life. She said that healthy people are getting this and some are dying. So it has a mostly happy ending. She was released after a little over a week. She was quarantined to her parents' home in rural Sonoma County, and she feels like she's one of the lucky ones. Take a look at that if you have a chance. Here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast, we're operating my community fund, and I want to acknowledge another nice donation that came in over the weekend from a person who prefers not to be named. And today, I don't have any requests for grants, but we are handing out $100 grants to people who contact me and describe your need. All you have to do is email me, peter@peterbcollins.com. If you want to make a contribution, you can use that same email address over at PayPal. And if you prefer, you can communicate by the U.S. mail at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. If you need help, we would like to be there for you. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are some people who have contrarian views. Number one, I respect your right to post those on Facebook, tweet them out, express them in any way you wish. I ask you to be responsible and not emotional or hysterical or overly political. But I do respect that there are people who think this is overblown. People who dispute that using ventilators is a good idea, including some respected medical people, or at least people who appear to have those credentials. And so today I want to share with you an open letter that was written to CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And RFK Jr. has become controversial. He's viewed as an anti-vaxxer, even though I don't think that's a fair characterization. And in a letter, he goes through 10 different points that CNN has asserted and that Sanjay Gupta has either, openly endorsed or reported on or been present on screen when the claims were made. And I'm just going to cite a few for you because they're not specific to COVID-19. It has to do with CNN's history of what RFK calls routinely parroting the CDC's estimates of overall flu deaths. So, one of the claims here relates to the annual estimates of the number of people killed by the flu. Now, this becomes significant because people now frame, the flu can kill 60,000 a year, and we only have 40,000 dead so far in 60 days, attributed, even some maybe falsely attributed, to COVID-19. So Kennedy writes, the NCHS, that's the National Clearinghouse, the report of the average number of mortalities attributable to influenza on death certificates is little more than 1,000 per year. CDC devises its inflated estimate by deliberately conflating flu deaths with pneumonia deaths. Kennedy says, subtracting pneumonia, the true number of influenza-associated deaths from 1979 to 2002 averaged 1,348 annually. And he argues by faithfully parroting CDC-inflated numbers with no due diligence, CNN has made itself complicit in this annual charade. Next assertion broadcast on CNN. CNN routinely promotes the flu shot for everyone older than 6 months. Fact, he says. In reality, there's absolutely no scientific basis for the CDC's assertion that the influenza vaccine is the most effective way to prevent the flu. He later argues that if you get a flu shot every year, you are less responsive to it, and it provides much lower levels of immunization. Assertion On CNN urges seniors to get their flu shots. CDC credits the vaccine with a dramatic reduction in influenza-related deaths among the elderly. Fact, says Kennedy. The scientific community has thoroughly debunked CDC's claim that the flu shot reduces deaths among seniors. 7. CNN assertion. You frequently inform the CNN audience that the flu vaccine is safe and significant side effects are very rare. Fact, from Kennedy. Actual injury rates are impossible to determine since flu shots are exempt from pre- and post-marketing placebo studies required of other medicines, and because the Health and Human Services post-marketing surveillance system captures fewer than 1% of vaccine injuries. So there's more to this, and I think you have an idea of how our media routinely reports data that it has not directly vetted, relying on government agencies, and there is another valid point of view. I think you should expose yourself to RFK Jr.'s open letter to Sanjay Gupta and see what you think. Today was a dark day for the American oil industry. For the first time ever, the price of U.S. crude oil collapsed into negative territory. That means that the market has so little need for this crude oil product that they're basically saying, you got to pay me to take it. There are tankers that are idling off the coast in the Gulf and on the eastern seaboard, loaded with crude oil and no place to dump it. I hope they don't dump it into the sea, but hey, a real pirate would say, hey, I'm just going to open up the drain valves and let this float away because I'm not going to pay somebody to take it off my hands. So the global supply-demand imbalance has started to really manifest itself in prices, says Bjornar Tonhaugen, head of oil at Rystad Energy. As production continues relatively unscathed, storage is filling up by the day. The world is using less and less oil, and producers now feel how this translates. And this, of course, critically cripples the shale industry and the frackers who are pulling that ugly crude out of the ground. And I heard Rusty Limbaugh there saying that this is what the Democrats want. Well, certainly we would prefer that they leave it in the ground. If you care about climate change and its risk to the planet in any way. And as we approach Earth Day, there is a certain irony that the so-called free market is ready to reject oil and values it, at least for now, in negative territory. I want to recommend that you take a look at gregpalast.com. He's one of my favorite reporters, and he observes that it was 10 years ago today that the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico blew up, killed 11 men, and created one of the ugliest oil blowouts and spills, poisoning the Gulf of Mexico in certain zones. They're now dead zones. And he is sharing a 12-minute excerpt from a feature-length documentary that has been seen in Europe but banned in the United States. And he reports that 17 months before the Deepwater Horizon blew up, that there was a stunningly similar blowout in the Caspian Sea. And the same operator, BP, owned that rig. And the Obama Interior Department tried to block the drilling, but pressure from Congress allowed BP to go ahead. After BP, Chevron, and Exxon executives testified to Congress, just before the blowout, there had never been a problem with its deepwater drilling. In Israel, there has been a deal cut between Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. And oh, is it ugly. They're calling it an emergency unity government. The agreement was reached at 7:15 p.m. Israel time today. It extends Netanyahu's tenure as prime minister. He gets to retain his seat with a promise that may never be fulfilled that Gantz gets to take over in a year and a half. And this appears to be just another ploy to defer the corruption trial on 3 different charges of Netanyahu and allow him to ravage the Palestinians with the friendly Trump government and Crown Prince Jared there to approve of everything they do. And for a contrasting view, over at Mint Press News, Miko Peled, the son of an Israeli general who is quite a truth teller. He writes, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, one would expect the desire to work as one world to curb the spread of the virus would outweigh any considerations of politics, race, or religion. However, the violence and neglect of Israel's Zionist government and non-governmental bodies toward Palestinians not only continues in full force, but in many cases has increased. March and April of this year will be remembered not only for the pandemic, but for the violence meted out by the Israeli authorities against the populations that Zionists are determined to destroy. Palestinians living under occupation in the large ghettos erected by Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and those who languish in Israeli jails. In addition, there are the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews who live in segregated communities and are despised by the Israeli state. There's much more in his piece. I've put up the link to Mint Press News in the show file for today's podcast. And briefly, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who essentially inherits the torch of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders fading. She is holding out on a formal endorsement of Joe Biden. She has conceded she'll vote for the Democratic nominee, but she's trying to extract some progressive concessions, saying that unity isn't a feeling, it's a process, and I think Biden can go further. And separately, in an appearance last Tuesday in New York, reported by Newsweek, and I saw this nowhere else, she was asked by someone in the audience about the allegations of sexual assault made by Tara Reade against Joe Biden, her former boss, when he was a senator and she was a staffer. And to her credit, and, you know, I don't agree with her positions on everything. Particularly, she's been silent about Venezuela. At any rate, she was pretty honest here. She said, I think it's legitimate to talk about these things. If we want to have integrity, you can't say, you know, both believe women, support all of this, until it inconveniences you. And she said that the not discussing Me Too issues in order to improve Biden's chances of beating Trump in November is the exact opposite of integrity. And she went on to say, I find this kind of silencing of all dissent to be a form of gaslighting. A lot of us are survivors, and it's really, really hard and uncomfortable. And finally today, a bit of a surprise. Now, it only affects 2 states, Louisiana and Oregon, and the issue at hand here is a relic of the Klan and the deep discrimination that they practiced. So the legacy is that in Louisiana and Oregon, the law does not require a unanimous vote by a jury to convict for major crimes. And the way the court lined up on this is really unusual. The decision for the majority was written by one of Trump's appointees, Neil Gorsuch. And I have some respect for him that he went deep into the history of this and declared that 48 other states require a unanimous jury decision, that this is tainted by the history of racism. And so he led this, and get this, he was joined by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, and Sonia Sotomayor, the Democratic appointees, as well as Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh. Now, Thomas disagreed with some of Gorsuch's reasoning, and Sotomayor and Kavanaugh wrote separately to explain their reasons for overruling a previous decision. The minority was the Chief Justice Roberts, Samuel Alito, and liberal Justice Elena Kagan, who is described as reluctant to overturn precedent. You know, that stare decisis thing, the super-duper precedent? I find this fascinating. Thanks for joining me today for my extended news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the darn place, worldwide. You'll find it on YouTube. I'll be back on Wednesday. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling